Okay, everybody, here's session 3.5. We're going to be talking about how nonprofits do their budgeting and also revenue projection to estimate how much they'll be bringing in future years. The goals for this class session are for you to show familiarity with basic budgeting practices, demonstrate how to calculate program ratios, explain why focusing on nonprofit program ratios can actually limit impact. I want you to be able to explain the difference between real and nominal dollars and calculate real dollars using inflation measures. And then finally, how to project revenue using a basic projection model. Let's talk first about budgeting. The thing about budgeting in any organization is that it's the way you undertake your strategy. If you want to know the real strategy of a nonprofit, look at their budget because their budget is going to determine whether or not they actually execute on their strategy. And if you don't decide on your strategy in your budget, then whatever your budget is will determine your strategy for you. And that's not what you want to happen. Some principles or ideas to understand about budgeting in nonprofit organizations. First of all, a lot of nonprofits are dealing with both ongoing operational costs, but then also capital or special project costs. And it's important to budget for these separately. So you have your operational budget, and then if you're sort of building a new building or doing any other kind of like one-time special thing, you have a separate budget for any capital or other special projects. And this is a way you can make sure that your projects are on track and they're not getting mixed in with your operational budgets. Nonprofits have functional budgets, and these are how you allocate how much you're going to put toward fundraising, toward programs, toward administrative, and we're going to talk more about program ratios and how those are calculated. If you have restricted funds guiding your activities, so you took a big donation to provide clean water to a particular set of communities, and you should be budgeting those restricted funds accordingly. And then all of these separate budgets you would pull together in a master budget. It's important that when you're budgeting, you're also projecting your revenue in your budget, that you're not just sort of projecting expenses, but that you also have done revenue projections and you have a sense of what money is coming in so you know how much to allocate toward the various expenses in your budget. And if you're doing budgeting for the first time, it's a good idea to take a look at sample budgets from other organizations to make sure you're not missing any key expenses, because there might be things that you are going to spend your money on, but it just hasn't occurred to you. And if you look at sample budgets of similar organizations, that'll give you a sense of what costs you might incur over the year. Some budgeting best practices, make sure you involve everybody who's relevant in building the budget, make sure that the people who know how much stuff costs are participating and that your board is approving the budget at the end. You really should be budgeting monthly, not just annually. It's a bad habit to budget. It's kind of laziness to budget just for, just for like a year-long period, because you need to know what money you'll have at particular points of the year. You should always budget in a way that leaves room for a reserve, so that way if certain things are overspent, you have the reserve to draw from for those, unexpectedly high expenses. You should be tracking performance against past budgets. You should be seeing how well you did against your previous budget, so that way you can make sure you're doing a better job budgeting in the future. And anytime a big unexpected change happens that has financial impact, you should be rebudgeting, because that rebudget process will help you to avoid overcommitment to bad ideas or strategies. So these are principles that are involved in the budgeting process. It would be kind of hard to just teach you, like to actually do a full-blown budget. It would take a lot more time than I want, because we wouldn't need to spend our time on other things. But if you get involved in a budget process, you're going to see all of the things that we've talked about here. It really is the sort of thing that you just, when you do it, you want to do it with guidance or advice or engagement with somebody who's done it before. Okay, let's talk about calculating program ratios. The program ratio we've talked about before when we were talking about the nonprofit structure stuff. And we were talking about how donors sort of over-focus on program ratios. And what they don't understand is that this is just a calculation that comes from a tax form, specifically page 10 of the 990. Now, even though I'm not a big fan of program ratios as a measure of how good a job the nonprofit is doing, it still is important for you guys to understand how program ratios are actually calculated. And they're calculated using form, like I said, page 10 of the 990. And here you'll see the statement of functional expenses. Now, I've condensed this form because if you notice, I skip from line 1 to line 25. It's because there's a bunch of stuff in the middle that I've cut out. But at the bottom on line 25, at the bottom of page 10 on line 25, you'll see total functional expenses. You'll see total expenses in column A. And here I took Red Cross, and so their total expenses that year were almost $3 billion. And then column B has everything that's considered a program service expense. And so this is everything that they can say is directed toward a charitable purpose. And for them, that was $2.6 billion. Their management and general expenses, so these are expenses that aren't going directly toward a charitable program. That was $103 million, and then their fundraising expenses were $177 million. So the way we would calculate a program ratio here is we would take total program expenses and divide it by total expenses. So that would be line 25B divided by line 25A in this case. And so if we do that calculation for the Red Cross, it means they have a program ratio of 90.4%. Now, the reason I chose Red Cross here is because there was some years ago an article in ProPublica accusing Red Cross of monkeying with their numbers to make their program ratio seem especially high, which is, like I said, focusing on the wrong thing. I'm normally a big fan of that news outlet, but I wasn't for this article because it's not what should matter. And let's talk about that actually. Ratios versus impact. Program ratios are a great management tool. They're good for nonprofit leaders to understand how they're allocating their resources. And if your program ratio is getting less efficient, meaning that number is going down, that percentage number I showed you is going down, then what it tells you is that maybe you should be trying to find ways to direct more toward your charitable activities. But they don't measure impact. And this is why donors shouldn't care about them. An analogy I like to use is you don't go to a restaurant and make that decision based on how efficiently the kitchen is run. Like, you're not asking, like, how much are you paying your chef, and are you paying your chef too much? Like, you don't do that when you go to a restaurant. You go to a restaurant because you want to buy a meal that is worth the price. And donors that focus on program ratios are focusing on how well the kitchen is being run rather than how good the meal is. The meal in this analogy is impact. Like, what positive impact is the nonprofit having in the world? And that's what donors should be paying attention to, not like how much the kitchen staff is being paid. And all budget decisions for a nonprofit should be prioritizing impact. What that means is sometimes you'll allocate money toward an administrative cost or to a fundraising cost because those expenses are going to lead to better impact than shoveling it into a program that might need improvement in a way that these other expenses would be helpful. Nonprofits that show robust impact have better stories to tell their donors. Rather than saying, we have a 90% program ratio, you ought to be able to go to the donors and say, we helped 30,000 people escape poverty. It's a far better story if you're focused on impact. So it's important that you know how to calculate program ratios, and you will have donors or private foundations that are going to ask you for your program ratios, but you as a manager should be using them to help you maximize impact. And then if you have good impact data, you're going to be more persuasive to donors. Okay, we need to talk a little bit about the difference between real and nominal dollars. If you've had econ before this topic, then you know how the difference between real and nominal dollars. If this is new to you, then we'll go through that so you can understand it. For this little description, I'm going to use some data from the March of Dimes. So this is the organization that helped eradicate polio in the United States. After polio was eradicated, they moved to other birth defects. And the reason it's called March of Dimes is because they very famously, back when they were working on polio, raised money by having walkathons, which weren't a thing back then, but they are now. And so the idea is people contribute dimes for every mile you walked back when these donations were being made. Here are the 990 statements of revenue for the March of Dimes during this 3-year period, 2003 to 2004, and then 2004 to 2005. So we have three snapshots of their revenue for that year. And then with this, we can make comparisons between them. I'm going to pull out their total direct public support. So this is what they raised in donations in each of those years. So if you were to look at this number, you would look at these and say, hey, this is great. The March of Dimes is growing its fundraising every year. Each year they're increasing how much they raise from donors. But we need to evaluate whether or not that's really true. To do this, we're going to use a rate of change calculation, which is tracking how much something changes from one period to the next. And then we're going to compare it to inflation numbers. So if we look at how much public support changed from 2004 to 2005, we would take the 2005 number, subtract 2004, divided by 2004, and this will give us the percentage change. So from 2004 to 2005, public support grew by 2.73%. So that means the 2005 support is 1.027 times higher than what it was the previous year, right? Except that's assuming that the value of a dollar stays consistent during that time period, which it doesn't. Generally speaking, dollars get less valuable from one year to the next, and this is inflation. And here's just a little table illustrating it. Nominal the way to think about what nominal means is in name only, meaning it's a dollar in name only, not in purchasing power necessarily, but just because the number one is printed on the bill. And so where in 2005, $1,000 was worth $1,000, in 2006 had $1,000 printed on it, we're talking about two different values in terms of like actual purchasing power. And if we had 3% inflation over that year-long period, then from 2005 to 2006, we would see the value of the dollar shrink by 3%. So $1,000 in 2005 is only worth $970 in terms of like its purchasing power a year later. So this is the effect that inflation has, is it shrinks the value of dollars over time. A nonprofit would ideally have its revenue growth beat inflation, because if your revenue is growing, but it's growing slower than inflation, then you're actually shrinking economically speaking, because your dollars don't have as much power as they had the year before. Inflation is measured in a variety of ways. It's measured through three main ways. CPI means Consumer Price Index, PPI means Producer Price Index, IPD means Implicit Price Deflator. The first one, CPI, is measuring inflation by the kind of products that consumers buy. What happens is the Fed gathers together a whole bunch of, or maybe it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, gathers together the prices on a whole bunch of purchases, a whole bunch of products that people typically buy. So they look at the cost of televisions and eggs and a gallon of gasoline and electricity going into your home and so on. And so they look at what a consumer typically buys, and then they track average price changes over time. And that's how they calculate the CPI. The PPI is the same idea, the same sort of basket of goods, but here the goods are what producers typically buy. And so it's going to be things like lumber or labor or other stuff like that. And then IPD is the same idea, but but the basket of goods is made up of the kinds of products that government buys when it's doing what it does. The appropriate inflation measure for a nonprofit probably depends best on its revenue source. So if you rely on a lot of donations, you should probably be using CPI, because that will be the inflation measure faced by your donors, and that will have an influence on how much they donate to you. The way that inflation is calculated is they use what are called index numbers. They take all those price changes, and then they have just sort of like a number that on its own is meaningless, but that number changes over time. And so the way the inflation numbers make sense is when you can compare one index number against another, like what's the index number for 2005 compared to the index number for 2006. This is how we'd figure out inflation. So if we were to take real public support of the March of Dimes, that change from 2005, how much it was in 2005, and then we divide it by the rate, by the change in CPI during the same time period, like how much did CPI change? And here it grew like by about 3.4%, which means an inflation rate of 3.4%. If we were to apply that number, the sort of the index change against the real public support, so we're basically weighting the 2005 numbers and turning them into $2004. is what we're doing with this calculation. Basically, the real public support for that year was 199.78 million. And in real dollars, it means that 2005 support was lower than 2004 support. What we're getting is the March of Dimes grew in nominal dollars that year from 201 million to 205 million. But because of inflation, their actual, like real dollar fundraising shrunk from 201 million to 199 million, because that's the effect that inflation has. Now, you could go look up the CPI tables and you could look up the index numbers for all the years, but a much easier way to do this is to just take your number that you want to like turn into a different number from a different year. And so using this calculator on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. So here what I've done is I've taken the 2006 donations to March of Dimes, 2005 donations to March of Dimes. You can see that's in the top part of the calculation. And then in the bottom, I choose what I want to convert it to, December 2004 dollars in this case. And it gets you the same number if you notice from what I calculated on the previous slide. And so this way you don't have to do the math. You just plug it into the calculator and you can turn dollars from any year into the equivalent dollars from any other year. And this is the goal. This is what you want to be doing. Because if you do this, then you're going to be comparing apples to apples, dollars, weighted by inflation. And so the reason this all matters is because if you're going to project, if you're going to pay attention to your revenue trends, you need to be comparing revenue over time using real dollars. You should be, rather than using nominal dollars where inflation is hidden and then the true value of your dollar gets lost, you over time should be changing. You should be you should be comparing your past revenue by a standard amount like $2,003 kind of a thing. So what does this have to do with projecting revenue? Well, you can spot trends, right, in your revenue over time by looking at real dollar comparisons. And then using those trends, you can then look in individual revenue categories and pay attention to how those revenue categories change over time. And then you can project into the future. And you can sort of get an estimate of what inflation might be. And there are agencies that publish inflation estimates. And then you use your past trends plus inflation projections, and then you can estimate how much revenue you expect to have in the future. And you're going to go in a variety of ways. If you have large donors, you're going to project revenue donor by donor. You're going to ask yourself, can we get $500,000 from this person again this year? You're going to look at any earned income, like if you're selling products or services, what have the trends been in the past and what are you expecting in the future for those things you're selling? If you are projecting you'll be able to bring in some new donations, then you're going to include that in your revenue projections. If you have investment income, you're going to project how much you might be drawing from that, especially if you have a large endowment. And then if you're doing any fundraising events, you'll do projection on those fundraising events. These are all different ways that you might bring in money as a nonprofit organization, and you're going to project based on past trends, how that went. For the assignment, you're going to lack a lot of this revenue by category information for the team assignment that you guys are doing. And so, but I'm going to have you do broad revenue projections based on any major revenue categories, looking at past trends. So what you're going to do is you're going to take 3 years worth of 990s, you're going to equalize them to turn them into real dollars. So like, let's say you took a 2017, 2018, 2019, 990. Those are older, but let's say you did that. You want to convert them all to like $2019 or all to $2017. And then that will show you the trend in real terms. And then you're going to use that trend to project revenue going forward. And that's it for this class session. We'll see you all in class.